I stood outside the dressing room, hands trembling as my granddaughter's laughter sliced through the walls like glass. "She's too old and pathetic to be seen at my wedding," Sophie said, each word sharp enough to draw blood. After 72 years of raising children, burying a husband, and holding a family together with quiet strength, this was how I was repaid. Not with gratitude, but with exile, so I said nothing. I simply walked out, called the venue she thought was hers, and signed the contract before her tears could even begin. "We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence. It lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe." Ellie Barrett stood frozen just outside the dressing room of Charleston's most fashionable bridal boutique, the smell of pressed silk and roses clinging to the air. Inside, laughter spilled from Sophie and her bridesmaids, sharp and cutting in a way only young women can be when they think they're safe from consequence. "She's too old and pathetic to be at my wedding," Sophie said, her voice carrying through the thin walls. "I don't want her shuffling down the aisle looking like some relic." The words landed like a slap. At 72, Ellie was accustomed to strangers overlooking her in restaurants, to clerks speaking slowly as though age had dulled her hearing. But hearing her own granddaughter reduce her to a joke carved deeper than any slight from the outside world. Then came Tina's voice, smooth, dismissive, and edged with cruelty. "We'll keep her in the back row. Or not at all. She'll understand." The chorus of laughter that followed was warm, conspiratorial, and final. Ellie's throat tightened. She reached for her handbag, straightened her posture, and walked out without a word. The door chime rang softly as she stepped into the humid Charleston air. To anyone passing by, she looked poised, almost regal. But inside, something fragile had splintered. The quiet of her kitchen greeted her like an old companion. Afternoon light painted long stripes across the table where countless family dinners had once been served. Ellie lowered herself into her chair, her hands folded neatly, though they trembled faintly. Her eyes wandered toward the corner where her sewing machine sat covered, a silent witness to years of care. She remembered the night Sophie begged her to finish that pale pink prom dress. Satin had slipped stubbornly under her fingers, but Sophie's joy in front of the mirror had made the hours worthwhile. Now the memory soured, leaving her with the metallic taste of betrayal at the back of her tongue. She pressed her palms flat against the table, forcing composure. The clock ticked loudly on the wall, each second mocking her with its steady rhythm. The crunch of tires on gravel outside stirred her from the memory. The back door creaked and Miriam Cole stepped in without knocking, just as she always had. Silver-haired, quick-eyed, and dressed in linen with the efficiency of a woman who never wasted a second. Miriam dropped her purse on the counter. "You didn't answer my call," she said, scanning Ellie's face. Her voice softened. "What's wrong?" Ellie's lips tightened. She lifted the teapot, then set it back down untouched. "She thinks I'm pathetic," she said finally, her voice controlled but low. "Too old to be seen. Too embarrassing." She let the words settle between them like dust in a sunbeam. "After everything I've done, that's her opinion of me." Miriam's eyes narrowed, her expression shifting from sympathy to something sharper. "Sophie?" Ellie gave the smallest nod. Her and Tina. Laughing about it, bold as brass. She tapped her nails against the table, each beat deliberate. Then her gaze lifted, steady and cold. "They think I'll sit quietly while they decide where I belong." A thin, dangerous smile tugged at her lips. "Let's see how pathetic she feels without a venue." Miriam raised an eyebrow, part wary, part intrigued. Ellie's phone buzzed on the table. She slid it closer, the glow of the screen painting her lined face in blue light. Sophie's latest Instagram post gleamed, a glossy photo of the White Harbor Pavilion, Charleston's prized waterfront gem. The caption gushed, "Can't wait to marry the love of my life here. Dream come true." Ellie narrowed her eyes. Sophie had already declared her victory to the world, boasting of a crown she hadn't yet secured. A careless mistake, Ellie thought. She scrolled through the congratulatory comments, her expression unreadable, then switched apps with a decisive tap. Her eyes sharpened, her breath steadying. Miriam, she said, her voice stripped of all tremor now, quiet but carrying the weight of iron. Let's see who really holds the contract. And for the first time that day, Ellie Barrett allowed herself the smallest smile. Ellie's eyes lingered on the glowing photo of the White Harbor Pavilion, Charleston's waterfront jewel, the pride of brides who could afford to lock it down. Sophie had splashed it across Instagram like a conquest, as if a post alone could seal contracts. Ellie's lips pressed together. Paper mattered more than vanity, and Sophie had always been careless with details. She leaned back in her chair, the ceiling fan stirring the heavy air as if urging her forward. White Harbor Pavilion, she murmured, testing the name on her tongue, letting it ground her resolve. Miriam, perched on the other side of the table, was already flipping open her tablet. Her quick fingers tapped, searching public records, pulling up business directories. Owner's still Harold Finch, she said, squinting at the screen. Been his for years. You remember him? Ellie nodded. The memory of Harold, thick-shouldered, his hair always neat, his handshake firm, flickered in her mind. Her late husband used to play cards with him at the Rotary Club. Reliable, old school, the type who believed a word and a signature carried weight. Call him, Ellie said quietly. Now. Miriam raised an eyebrow but dialed anyway. The line clicked, followed by Harold's low, even drawl. Finch here. Harold, it's Miriam Cole. I'm sitting here with Eleanor Barrett. A pause, then warmth entered his tone. Well, I'll be damned. Eleanor, how are you? Ellie leaned closer to the phone, her voice steady. I'm fine, Harold. I was hoping you could tell me about a booking. White Harbor Pavilion, early fall, the Barrett girls' wedding. On the other end, Harold exhaled. The Granddaughter. She toured, sure, looked around, talked big. But no contract, no deposit, nothing binding. His voice sharpened with certainty. Until I see ink, it's nothing. Miriam's eyes flicked up at Ellie, her lips twitching with satisfaction. Ellie's voice remained calm, though a spark lit behind her words. So it's still free? For the right client? Yes, Harold said, as if testing her. I don't play favorites, Eleanor, but I do value loyalty, and I don't double book. Ellie felt the weight of his words settle in her chest, like a key fitting into a lock. Then let's talk in person, she said. The next morning, Charleston's streets glistened after a night of rain. Ellie drove past oak-lined boulevards and gas lanterns still burning pale against the dawn. She parked near the pavilion, its whitewashed walls gleaming against the gray-blue river beyond. From the outside, the building looked like a postcard, wide windows catching the waterlight, steps polished to a soft sheen. Harold greeted her at the entrance, his suit jacket neatly pressed despite the humidity. Still elegant as ever, Eleanor, he said with a nod. His eyes, however, were all business. Ellie smiled faintly, but her gaze swept the ballroom, the polished hardwood floors, the chandeliers swaying slightly with the faint breeze, the scent of lemon polish hanging in the air. She didn't see just a room. She saw Sophie's entitlement collapsing in real time. This place has held 100 vows, Harold said, walking beside her. But contracts, Eleanor, contracts hold more than vows ever do. She stopped beneath the largest chandelier, her reflection shimmering in its crystal drops. Then I'd like to secure mine. Harold studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Come by my office this afternoon. We'll make it official. That evening, back at her kitchen table, Ellie felt her pulse slow to something steadier. She had played her first card, and Harold had not only answered but opened the door wider than she'd hoped. Miriam poured 2 glasses of iced tea, the clink of ice loud in the silence. She'll never see it coming, she said, handing one to Ellie. Ellie's phone buzzed. Another post from Sophie. This time it was a boomerang video, her arms thrown wide on the pavilion steps, captioned with glittering emojis. Can't wait to marry at White Harbor Pavilion. Ellie let out a soft breath through her nose, the faintest hint of amusement tugging at her mouth. Sophie had just declared the pavilion hers, to hundreds of followers, without a shred of paper to her name. Ellie set the phone down gently, her decision ironclad. Ellie's heels clicked against the marble foyer of White Harbor Pavilion, each step echoing like a quiet declaration of intent. The air smelled faintly of salt from the nearby harbor, carried in through tall windows that framed the water like living paintings. Sunlight struck the crystal chandeliers above, scattering shards of light across the polished floor. It was the sort of space that made people lower their voices instinctively, as though history itself demanded respect. Harold Finch walked at her side, his shoes squeaking faintly against the waxed wood. "It hasn't changed much since your husband last saw it," he said, a touch of nostalgia softening his usual clipped tone. Ellie's eyes swept the ballroom, the grand archways, the hand-carved banisters, the faint lemon polish lingering in the air. "He would have admired the symmetry," she said softly. Nothing pleased him more than a building that stood both strong and beautiful. Harold smiled faintly, glancing at her. Charles always had an eye for detail. City planning lost something when he passed. His gaze lingered on Ellie, a note of respect there. "Funny thing, Eleanor. This hall is what he once called Charleston's crown jewel. Said it would outlast us all." Ellie paused under the largest chandelier, her reflection fractured in its prisms. He wasn't wrong. Her voice carried not just admiration but a steady resolve. They toured the veranda, where the breeze carried the faint cries of gulls and the briny scent of the harbor. Ellie rested her hand on the cool railing, her eyes tracing the horizon. Couples had stood here for decades, promising forever beneath the same sky. She felt the weight of that continuity, of stepping into a place meant for memory making, and it hardened her determination. Harold leaned on the railing beside her. "You know she came through here," he said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "Your granddaughter. Walked the halls like she already owned the place. Talked about flowers and lighting, but not once did she ask about contracts. I don't do handshakes with talkers." Ellie let the breeze lift her hair from her face. She was raised believing things would always be handed to her, she said quietly. "But I don't deal in assumption. Neither do you." Harold studied her face, weighing her words. Then, with the gravity of an old-world judge, he nodded once. "First right of refusal belongs to you, Eleanor. Always did. If you want it, I'll block the date today. No questions." Minutes later, they sat across from each other in Harold's paneled office. The scent of cedar hung in the air, blending with the faint musk of old books stacked on shelves. Papers lay spread neatly across the mahogany desk, contracts crisp and ready. Ellie took the pen without hesitation. 60 and ready. Her hand was steady, the black ink flowing smoothly across the page, as she signed her name on Sophie's carefully chosen wedding date. With each stroke, a quiet thrill sparked in her chest. Not gloating, not spite, but the satisfaction of reclaiming dignity with action. When she finished, Harold extended his hand. His grip was firm, unwavering. "It's yours," he said. "Paid in full and final." Ellie returned the handshake, her gaze unwavering. "Thank you, Harold, for honoring paper over pretense." That evening, as cicadas buzzed outside her kitchen window, Ellie sipped her tea with Miriam at the table. The contract folder sat between them, its weight more satisfying than any weapon. Miriam lifted her glass. "She posted it online," she said, smirking. "But you, my friend, just locked it in stone." Ellie allowed herself a rare, quiet laugh. The sound surprised even her. It had been weeks since anything had felt light. "Let's see what tune they sing now." Her phone buzzed on the counter. Harold's name lit up the screen. Ellie answered, his voice low but steady. "Eleanor," Harold said. "Your daughter-in-law just called. Furious doesn't begin to cover it. She thought screaming at me would change ink on paper." Ellie set her tea down gently, the faint clink of glass punctuating her calm. A small smile curved her lips. The storm had already begun. Harold Finch's phone rattled on his desk, the shrill ring slicing through the quiet of his office. He glanced at the caller ID and sighed. Tina Barrett. He braced himself, letting the second ring stretch before picking up. The voice that burst through the receiver was high-pitched and venomous. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Harold? That date belongs to my daughter." Harold leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking beneath him. Outside his window, the harbor shimmered with late afternoon light, a sharp contrast to the storm in his ear. Correction, he said evenly, his southern drawl calm and deliberate. That date belongs to Eleanor Barrett. Contract signed. Deposit paid, done deal. You can't do this. Tina shrieked. She toured with you. You knew she wanted it. Wanting and owning aren't the same thing, Harold replied. He kept his tone measured, though his jaw tightened. Your daughter never signed a contract, never wrote a check. Eleanor did. I don't break my word. Mrs. Barrett. On the other end, Tina's breath came hard, like she was pacing. Then another voice cut in, sharp and frantic. Sophie, it's sabotage. She's doing this to humiliate me. Harold rubbed the bridge of his nose. Patience thinning. Young lady, if your grandmother wanted to ruin you, she wouldn't have done it with paperwork. She followed the rules. You didn't. The line went silent for a beat, just the sound of their collective outrage simmering. Then Tina hissed, You'll regret this, Harold. We'll make sure everyone in Charleston knows how you do business. Go ahead, Harold said, already reaching to hang up. The truth speaks louder than tantrums. He set the phone down with finality, letting their voices cut off mid-threat. Meanwhile, Ellie's house was quiet, her phone buzzing across the table with incoming calls. She ignored each one, sipping tea in deliberate silence. Miriam sat across from her, reading the caller ID with barely restrained amusement. They're relentless, Miriam said, watching the screen flash Sophie Barrett again. You're not answering? Ellie shook her head, serene. Why would I? They think I should sit in the back row unseen. Silence suits me just fine. Miriam chuckled, leaning back in her chair. You didn't just take a chair at the table, you bought the whole damn table, and they can't stand it. Ellie allowed herself a small smile, though her eyes stayed sharp. Let them scream into the void. Paper doesn't bend to noise. But Tina wasn't done. After her call with Harold, she stormed into Sophie's bedroom, slamming the door so hard the mirror rattled. Sophie sat cross-legged on her bed, phone in hand, mascara streaking from tears. She stole it. Sophie cried, scrolling furiously through photos of the pavilion. She wants to ruin my wedding. This was supposed to be my day. Tina sat down beside her, grabbing her daughter's trembling hands. We'll fight her. We'll drag Harold's name through the mud if we have to. Nobody disrespects us like this. But what if people believe her? Sophie whispered, her voice breaking. Tina's eyes hardened. Then we make sure they don't. We control the story. By nightfall, the first strike came. A friend of Sophie's, one of her bridesmaids, leaked screenshots from their group chat. The images hit social media like sparks in dry grass. There, in brutal black and white text, Sophie and her friends had mocked Ellie mercilessly, pathetic, wrinkled, irrelevant. One message even joked about making her sit near the bathrooms during the ceremony. Within hours, the screenshots were everywhere, shared, commented, dissected. The tone wasn't sympathetic to Sophie. Strangers shook their heads at the cruelty, older locals especially outraged. Words like ungrateful and spoiled peppered the threads. Ellie's phone buzzed again, this time with notifications of her own. She glanced at one post, a stranger commenting, "No grandmother deserves this. Team Eleanor all the way." She set the phone down gently, the faintest flicker of satisfaction warming her chest. The storm she hadn't lifted a finger to unleash was now raging full force, and Sophie had lit the match herself. The screenshots didn't creep into Charleston quietly. They exploded. Within hours of Sophie's bridesmaid leaking the group chat, the images ricocheted across Facebook groups, Instagram stories, and local gossip threads. In sharp black font, Sophie's words, "She's pathetic, wrinkled, irrelevant." The cruelty of it stung even strangers. One line, "She'll ruin my wedding photos with her face alone," was reposted with thousands of comments beneath. Not pity for Sophie. Outrage for Ellie. By mid-morning, Miriam's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. She showed Ellie post after post, older women rallying online in defense. "My grandkids wouldn't dare talk this way." One comment read, "That bride needs a lesson in respect." Another woman had written, if my granddaughter called me irrelevant, I'd cut her out of the will. Miriam leaned back in her chair, satisfaction curling at the edges of her smile. They're hanging themselves without you saying a word. Don't you dare type a single response, Ellie. Ellie adjusted her reading glasses, scrolling briefly before setting her phone face down. Her tea sat cooling on the table, untouched. Why waste words on people who already condemned themselves? She said softly. Miriam chuckled. Exactly. Silence is louder than any post, but Sophie and Tina refused to surrender. That afternoon, Tina's voice crackled through a local radio interview, dripping with indignation. This is nothing but a vengeful act, she told the host. Ellie Barrett has been jealous of her own granddaughter for years. She's using money and manipulation to ruin Sophie's big day. Listeners weren't buying it. Callers flooded the line, some older, some not, all furious. You're blaming a 72-year-old woman for your daughter's bad manners? One caller snapped. Maybe raise her better. Sophie, meanwhile, took to Instagram Live. Her eyes were red from crying, her tone desperate. I just want a wedding where I don't feel attacked. She sniffled, spinning herself into victimhood. Yet behind her, on the dresser, lay the same phone that had carried her scathing words to the world. The comments scrolled faster than she could control. Respect your grandmother. Shame on you. Apologize. Sophie ended the stream abruptly, slamming the phone down so hard the sound echoed before the screen went black. At White Harbor Pavilion, Harold Finch poured himself a stiff bourbon and scrolled through the chaos. He shook his head, disgusted by what he read. He'd known Ellie for decades, dignified, steady, never one for theatrics. He opened his laptop, drafted a statement, and posted it on the venue's official page. The White Harbor Pavilion stands firmly by Mrs. Eleanor Barrett. She has conducted herself with dignity and respect. Her booking was legitimate, her payment valid. We honor contracts and character, not cruelty. We look forward to hosting her event. Within minutes, the post was shared widely. Customers commented their support for Harold's integrity. Some even promised to book events with him because loyalty still matters. When Miriam read it aloud to Ellie later that evening, she clapped her hands once. Now that is a man who understands reputation. Ellie, sitting in her armchair by the window, watched dusk paint the harbor in strokes of gold and rose. Her face stayed calm, but her eyes glimmered with something sharper. Let them scramble, she said, voice low but unshakable. I've already secured my peace, but peace was not what Sophie sought. Cornered by mounting shame, she made a reckless choice. Late that night, in the living room of Tina's suburban home, Sophie sat hunched over her laptop, makeup smeared from tears. She can't do this to me, she whispered, her voice frayed. There has to be a way to undo it. Tina, pacing the carpet with a glass of wine clutched tight, snapped, then we'll make it legal. We'll file a claim. Say she acted in bad faith. That she knew you wanted the date and stole it out of spite. Sophie's hands trembled as she typed. Her nails clattered against the keys, echoing through the room. She looked at her mother with wild eyes. If the law can't fix this, she said, then everyone will think I lost. Tina set her glass down hard enough to splash wine onto the carpet. Then we'll make sure the law does fix it. And with that, Sophie hit send on a legal complaint that would drag Eleanor Barrett into court. The courthouse smelled faintly of coffee and old wood polish, a mix that clung to its paneled walls. Eleanor Barrett sat quietly in the front row, hands folded in her lap, her posture straight despite the storm circling her. Sophie and Tina swept in moments later, their heels striking hard against the tile, like they could intimidate the building itself into siding with them. At the plaintiff's table, Sophie's lawyer shuffled papers dramatically, as if theatrics could compensate for weak footing. He rose, buttoned his jacket, and began. Your Honor, this case is about fairness. Mrs. Barrett acted in bad faith. She knew her granddaughter's intentions, knew she had chosen White Harbor Pavilion, and swooped in to block her out. Judge Daniel Reeves, a man with a lined face and piercing eyes, leaned back in his chair. He tapped his pen once against the bench, Unimpressed. Intentions, he repeated, his drawl deliberate. Counselor, last I checked, intentions don't sign contracts. Tina shifted in her seat, whispering furiously to Sophie. Sophie's cheeks burned crimson, her jaw tight. At the defense table, Miriam Cole, though retired from her paralegal career, sat with Ellie, her legal pad filled with neat, precise notes. Miriam had insisted on prepping Ellie down to the smallest detail, dates, receipts, even the ink color of the contract. Every question Sophie's side could raise, Ellie had the paper to silence it. When Miriam rose to speak, her tone was crisp, unflinching. Your Honor, White Harbor Pavilion was available. My client reviewed, signed, and paid in full. The plaintiff did not. There is no evidence of fraud, misrepresentation, or coercion. Only assumption. Judge Reeves leaned forward, studying the contract Harold Finch had provided. The courtroom was so still that Ellie could hear the soft hum of the fluorescent lights above. He flipped each page slowly, his expression giving nothing away. Finally, he set the contract down, adjusting his glasses. It's airtight, he said flatly. Signed, paid, binding. He looked at Sophie's lawyer. What you've brought me is a tantrum dressed as a lawsuit. The gavel's rap echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. The claim is denied, Judge Reeves declared. The date and venue belong to Eleanor Barrett. Gasps rippled across the courtroom. Sophie's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears that were equal parts fury and humiliation. Tina shot to her feet, fists balled at her sides. This is rigged. Tina shouted, her voice cracking. Cameras positioned near the back doors caught every second. Reporters leaned forward, pens flying, lenses clicking. Judge Reeves banged the gavel again. Order, Mrs. Barrett. You will maintain decorum or you'll be escorted out. Tina froze but seethed, her chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. Sophie slumped in her chair, mascara streaking, unable to meet Ellie's eyes across the aisle. Through it all, Ellie never flinched. She stood when the bailiff called dismissal, smoothing the front of her blazer with one hand. Not once did she look back at Sophie or Tina. With Miriam at her side, she walked toward the double doors, the cool air from the hallway rushing to meet her. The courthouse smelled of ink and dust, but to Ellie it smelled like vindication. Dignity, Miriam whispered as they stepped outside into the swarm of cameras. That's what wins every time. Ellie kept her chin high, her steps measured. She didn't wave, didn't gloat, didn't utter a word to the reporters shouting her name. She simply passed through them like the eye of a storm, calm and unshakable. By nightfall, the headlines were everywhere. Grandmother wins venue dispute against bride. The Charleston Gazette splashed the story across its homepage, the photo of Tina's outburst in the courthouse hallway, attached for good measure. Ellie closed her laptop softly, the glow fading from her glasses. She poured herself a glass of water, her face unreadable, but her hands steady as stone. By morning, the article laid out the facts. Eleanor Barrett, 72, had legally secured Charleston's most coveted wedding venue, while her granddaughter Sophie failed to sign a contract. It was balanced journalism, but the comments section tipped the scales. Good for her, contracts matter. My granny raised me better than this bride ever acted. This girl sounds spoiled rotten. Ellie scrolled briefly before pushing the laptop away. The glow of the screen reflected on her glasses, but she didn't linger. She had no need to read strangers validating what she already knew. Dignity spoke louder than tantrums. Miriam, however, was enjoying every second. She read comments aloud between bursts of laughter. Listen to this one. Pathetic, honey, you'll be lucky to be half as stylish as your grandma at 70. She nearly spilled her tea, laughing harder. They've turned her into a folk hero. Ellie. Ellie folded her napkin neatly beside her plate. Folk heroes don't chase clout. They just survive long enough to watch the foolish fall. Her voice was calm, but her eyes glimmered with a quiet, satisfied fire. Meanwhile, Sophie's world shrank with every notification. Her phone buzzed relentlessly with tags and mentions, each one cutting deeper. Memes bloomed overnight. Side-by-side images of Sophie crying in court next to Ellie, walking serenely through the courthouse doors. Captions read Grace versus Entitlement. Sophie locked herself in her room, curtains drawn, her face lit only by the angry glow of her screen. Each new post was a fresh sting, but what gutted her most were the comments from women old enough to be her mother or grandmother. They weren't just siding with Ellie, they were ridiculing Sophie's arrogance. Tina stormed through the house, her phone clutched in a death grip. They don't know the whole story, she hissed, pacing like a caged cat. But Sophie only curled tighter on her bed, humiliated in a way no Instagram filter could fix. At Ellie's house, however, Miriam leaned across the kitchen table with a new idea. Why stop here? She asked. You've got the venue, the sympathy, the press. Host your own event at White Harbor. Not a wedding, something bigger. Something that leaves a mark. Ellie raised a brow. I'm not in the business of parades. Not a parade, Miriam said, grinning. A dinner. A legacy dinner. For women who built this community and rarely get recognized. You know half the Women's Guild, Eleanor. You could fill the place with elegance and class. Make that hall shine brighter than Sophie's wedding ever could. Ellie's fingers tapped against her teacup. Thoughtful. The idea wasn't about revenge, it was about reclaiming the narrative. A celebration of the women who came before, who built the foundation, she murmured. Not pathetic. Not irrelevant. Exactly, Miriam said. And it'll sting twice as hard, because it won't even be about her. When Harold heard the idea later that week, he didn't hesitate. I'll make it work, he said, leaning across his desk with conviction. Discounts, extra staff, whatever you need. That ballroom belongs to you, Eleanor. Let's use it the way your husband would have wanted, showing the city what class looks like. Ellie met his gaze, her chin lifted with quiet pride. Then let's call it the Legacy Dinner. One night for women who don't usually get the spotlight. Harold smiled, a slow, satisfied expression. Then we'll make it unforgettable. But in another corner of Charleston, Sophie sat on the edge of her bed, scrolling desperately through venue websites. Each call ended the same way. Sorry, we're fully booked. Owners didn't need to say why. The headlines had already told the story. By the time Sophie closed her laptop with a sharp snap, her hands were trembling. There's nothing left, she whispered, panic swelling in her chest. And for the first time since the fiasco began, Sophie realized the truth. Every door in Charleston was closing, one by one. The morning after Ellie's story dominated the headlines, Sophie sat hunched over her laptop, scrolling through a list of Charleston venues, as though salvation hid behind one of the tabs. Her hands shook as she dialed the first number, nails tapping the phone impatiently as it rang. Good morning, Magnolia House Events. A chipper voice answered. Sophie forced a bright tone. Hi, this is Sophie Barrett. I'm looking to book a wedding for late September. The voice hesitated, then grew careful. I'm sorry, ma'am, but all of our dates are filled. But I just checked your site. Sophie snapped. You have openings. Another pause, heavy and uncomfortable. Company policy. We're not able to accommodate you at this time. The line went dead before Sophie could protest. She slammed the phone down, pacing the carpet, while Tina hovered at the doorway with crossed arms. That's the third one today, Sophie said, her voice cracking. They're all lying. They're protecting themselves, Tina muttered, her jaw set. This stupid press circus made you untouchable for all the wrong reasons. By afternoon, they had called nearly every respectable venue within 40 miles. Each rejection came wrapped in the same polite language. Fully booked. Policy changes. Unable to proceed at this time. At one boutique vineyard, the manager broke the pattern, her voice dripping with sympathy. Sophie didn't want. Off the record. It's not about space. Nobody wants the PR mess. Sorry, but your grandmother's got the city on her side. Sophie hung up before the woman could finish, her cheeks flaming. Across town, Harold Finch leaned on the railing of the White Harbor Pavilion veranda when Ellie arrived to finalize details for her legacy dinner. The harbor breeze smelled of salt and wet wood, the sunlight glittering on the water below. She came crawling back this morning, Harold said with a shake of his head. Begged me for the date. Offered to pay double. Ellie raised a brow, folding her hands over the railing. And what did you tell her? Harold's smile was grim but steady. Told her I don't double book, no matter who asks. Contract's a contract. Loyalty matters more than money. Miriam, who had tagged along, gave a sharp laugh. That's loyalty, Harold. Something your granddaughter never learned. Ellie didn't smile, but the faint flicker in her eyes showed she agreed. She looked out at the harbor, letting the gulls' cries fill the silence. Sophie was cornered, and Ellie didn't have to lift a finger. That night, Sophie sat at the kitchen table, her laptop glowing like a curse in the dim room. Tina hovered with a glass of wine, her face tense. Every decent place is gone, Sophie whispered. Her voice was ragged, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. Nobody will take us. Tina leaned over her shoulder. Then we don't need decent. We'll make our own dream out of whatever we can get. Sophie scrolled past the glossy venues and found a listing buried deep in the results. Bayview Storage and Event Space. Available immediately. The photos showed a cavernous, dimly lit warehouse with water-stained walls and dangling industrial bulbs. The floor looked uneven, the air thick with the smell of old wood and mildew. Sophie's lip trembled. It's hideous. It's space, Tina countered firmly. And space we can dress up. Drapes, flowers, lights. No one has to know what it really is. Sophie hesitated, her finger hovering over the Book Now button. The humiliation of her fall clashed with her desperation to salvage something of her wedding day. Finally, with a choked breath, she clicked. The confirmation email chimed seconds later. Ellie, asleep in her quiet Charleston home, had no idea that while her legacy dinner took shape in elegance, her granddaughter had just tied her future to a rundown warehouse that smelled of rust and regret. The warehouse door groaned open, the hinges protesting as Sophie and Tina stepped inside. A wave of stale air hit them, damp, sour, tinged with mildew. Dust floated in the shafts of light, sneaking through broken panes of glass high above, catching in Sophie's throat as she coughed. This was no White Harbor pavilion. The ballroom chandeliers she'd dreamed of were replaced by industrial bulbs dangling on frayed cords. The smooth hardwood floors of her Pinterest boards gave way to cracked concrete, pocked and uneven, stained from years of storage leaks. Somewhere in the shadows, a rat scurried, its claws clicking faintly before disappearing under a pallet. Sophie pressed her hand to her mouth, her stomach churning. Mom, no, this can't be it. Tina, ever defiant, marched forward in her heels, the sharp clack echoing in the cavernous space. It's nothing a decorator can't fix. Drapes along the walls, flowers to hide the cracks, lighting to disguise the ceiling. People won't remember the room, they'll remember you. But Sophie couldn't stop staring at the rust-streaked beams overhead, the faint drip-drip from a pipe somewhere in the darkness. It's not what I dreamed, she whispered, her voice cracking. Tears welled in her eyes. This is supposed to be the happiest day of my life, and it smells like mold. While Sophie fought back sobs in the hollow warehouse, Ellie sat in her own sunlit kitchen, the scent of lemon polish and fresh biscuits in the air. Miriam's phone buzzed, and she raised her brows as she read the message from her decorator friend. You won't believe this, Miriam said, turning the screen toward Ellie. The photos were grainy but unmistakable, shots of the warehouse's peeling paint, its bare rafters, the dismal rows of mismatched folding chairs stacked along one wall. Ellie leaned forward, her lips curving ever so slightly. She wanted me invisible, she said, her tone even. Now her wedding will be unforgettable, for all the wrong reasons. Miriam let out a sharp laugh, slapping her hand against the table. Charleston won't whisper about your legacy dinner anymore. They'll whisper about this. And Charleston did. By the next afternoon, word spread like wildfire across neighborhood groups, country club brunch tables and hair salon. Did you hear? Women whispered over coffee. The Barrett wedding isn't at White Harbor after all. It's at some old warehouse by the docks. At one boutique, a seamstress clucked her tongue as she pinned a gown. I wouldn't let my cousin throw a birthday party there. much less a wedding. By evening the gossip reached Ellie's ears not through malice, but through murmurs of sympathy. She's brought this on herself, Miriam told her firmly. The city sees it. You don't need to raise a finger. Ellie only stirred sugar into her tea, the spoon clinking softly against porcelain. I don't take joy in her misery, she said quietly, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of steel. But I won't apologize for her choices either. Sophie, however, had no such composure. Days of ridicule, whispers, and mounting humiliation wore her down until the bitterness boiled over. She drowned her frustration in wine one night at a downtown bar. Her bridesmaids clustered half-heartedly around her. The music thudded, glasses clinked, but Sophie sat hunched, mascara smudged, her voice growing louder with each drink. She thinks she's won, Sophie slurred, slamming her glass down hard enough to slosh red across the counter. My grandmother, pathetic, wrinkled, irrelevant. And now everyone thinks she's some saint. Her friends exchanged uneasy glances, but Sophie was too far gone. She pushed herself up from the stool, wobbling slightly, and stormed toward the door. The night air on King Street buzzed with conversation and clinking glasses as Ellie and Miriam stepped out of the cafe, their coats still carrying the faint warmth of roasted garlic and bread. The soft glow of lanterns flickered along the cobblestones, painting everything in gold. For a moment Ellie felt at peace. Then a voice tore through the calm like glass shattering. You! Sophie staggered toward her, wild-eyed, her words slurred by alcohol, but sharpened by rage. Pedestrians slowed, sensing drama. Ellie's hand tightened briefly on her clutch, but her face remained composed, as if Sophie's fury barely registered. You ruined my wedding, Sophie screamed, her voice cracking under the strain. You took everything from me because you can't stand not being the center of attention. The cafe's patio fell silent. Diners abandoned their forks, leaning forward. A few phones lifted discreetly, red recording dots glowing in the night. Miriam shifted closer to Ellie, her voice low. Don't give her a single word, Ellie. Let her hang herself. Ellie didn't nod, didn't blink, just stood tall under the lantern's glow, her silence heavier than any defense she could have given. Sophie lunged closer, her perfume mixed with the sour tang of wine. Say something. Admit what you did. Her fists clenched at her sides. You're pathetic. Everyone knows it. But Ellie's stillness only fanned Sophie's fury. The crowd thickened, whispers rippling like wind through leaves. Someone muttered, "That's the grandmother," and another replied, "She looks dignified to me." The breaking point came when Sophie slapped the cafe's outdoor table, the clang of cutlery scattering across the sidewalk. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," she bellowed. Ellie finally raised her gaze, steady, unshaken. She didn't speak, only met Sophie's eyes with the quiet force of someone who'd weathered storms far greater than a drunken tantrum. That silence broke Sophie more than words ever could. Her voice cracked into sobs as she stumbled back, mascara streaking down her face. "You've ruined me," she cried, collapsing into a chair as the cameras kept rolling. Miriam touched Ellie's arm gently. "That's enough for tonight." She guided her away from the crowd, leaning close to whisper, "You've already won." The two women walked down the street together, Ellie's heels clicking softly against the cobblestones, the noise of Sophie's unraveling shrinking behind them. She didn't look back once. By morning, the video was everywhere. Captioned Grandma Grace versus Bridezilla. It spread across TikTok, Facebook, even Twitter. Clips slowed down Ellie's calm stare, contrasting it with Sophie's screaming, her face red and twisted. The internet declared a victor, and it wasn't Sophie. Memes followed. One showed Ellie sipping tea with the words "Silence speaks louder than tantrums." Another zoomed on Sophie's tear-streaked face. When you lose the venue and the argument, Sophie woke to hundreds of notifications, each one a nail in the coffin of her reputation. She hurled her phone across the room, shattering it against the wall. Tina scrambled to undo the damage. She posted a shaky video of herself in the kitchen, claiming the footage was taken out of context. She blamed editing, lighting, even bias against young brides. But the comments were merciless. Context doesn't change screaming in the street. Your daughter owes her grandmother an apology. Stop digging the hole deeper. Within hours, Tina deleted the video, her silence confirming what the public already believed. But the confrontation had consequences beyond memes. Judge Reeves, who had presided over the venue case, called Tina's attorney the next day. His warning was firm. If Sophie Barrett continues harassing her grandmother, publicly or privately, I will entertain a petition for a restraining order. The message landed like a stone in Sophie's lap. The law itself was circling, and this time, silence wouldn't save her. The morning of Sophie's wedding broke gray and wet, drizzle pattering against the warped roof of the Bayview warehouse. Inside, the air carried a damp tang of mildew, poorly disguised by cheap floral sprays set along the entrance. Rental chairs wobbled on the uneven concrete floor, their metal legs scraping and screeching as ushers tried to force them into straight lines. Sophie stood in front of a cracked mirror, tucked into the makeshift bridal corner, her gown brushing against dusty floors covered with borrowed rugs. A drop of water plinked from the ceiling onto her veil, staining the lace. She flinched, her hands trembling as she yanked it off. This was supposed to be magical, she whispered, her voice brittle. Tina rushed to her side, fussing with the gown's hem. It will be. No one will notice the details. They'll only see you. But as Sophie peeked through the curtain at the rows of guests shifting uncomfortably on their shaky chairs, she heard the whispers. It smells musty in here. This doesn't feel like a wedding. Imagine choosing this place. Each murmur sliced deeper than the last. The ceremony limped forward. Just as the officiant began speaking, the lights flickered, once, twice, before sputtering back to life with a harsh buzz. A ripple of uneasy laughter spread through the crowd, quickly stifled. Sophie gripped her bouquet so tightly the stems bent, her smile frozen and brittle. Halfway through the vows, another drip landed squarely on the aisle runner, leaving a dark splotch near the bride's shoes. Sophie's face flushed crimson, and she blinked hard, willing the tears to stay put. By the time the officiant pronounced them married, the applause was thin, polite, and strained. Sophie clung to her new husband's arm, but her eyes darted nervously to the guests already reaching for their coats. Across the city, White Harbor Pavilion glowed with golden light. Chandeliers sparkled like constellations above the grand ballroom, where tables draped in ivory linens stretched elegantly across polished wood floors. Ellie moved gracefully among her guests, her navy gown gleaming under the lights. The legacy dinner was alive with warmth, laughter, clinking glasses, the scent of rosemary chicken and sweet pecan pie drifting from the kitchen. Women of all ages raised their glasses to toast her, some even wiping away tears as they thanked her for honoring them. Miriam leaned close, her eyes shining with pride. You've turned a dinner into a movement, Ellie. At the head of the room, Harold tapped his glass for attention. This, he said, his voice ringing out with conviction, is the event people will remember. A night where history meets dignity. The applause that followed was thunderous, echoing against the vaulted ceilings. Ellie smiled softly, her heart steady. She hadn't needed revenge tonight. Her legacy spoke for itself. By dawn, the proof of Harold's words spread online. Photos of the legacy dinner flooded social media. Ellie laughing with women half her age, her hand resting on Miriam's arm, the ballroom aglow with elegance. The hashtag #LegacyDinner trended locally, eclipsing Sophie's wedding completely. Meanwhile, the only images from Sophie's big day that leaked were less flattering. A rainwater drip landing near the cake, crooked rows of folding chairs, guests huddled in coats inside the drafty warehouse. Captions read, "From White Harbor dreams to warehouse reality." Sophie woke to the nightmare of seeing her wedding mocked across group chats and community boards. Her stomach knotted as she scrolled, each image a reminder of what she had lost. As if humiliation weren't enough, the mail delivered the final blow days later. An envelope arrived, bold letters stamped across the top. Notice of pending action. Inside was a bill from the decorator, invoices unpaid and fees overdue. Alongside it, a notice of lawsuit if the balance wasn't settled within 30 days. Tina's hands shook as she read it aloud, her face blanching. Sophie sank into the sofa, her bouquet now wilted in a vase, sitting mockingly on the coffee table. The wedding had cost them more than pride. Now it threatened to cost them everything else. The decorator she'd hired for the warehouse wedding, who had hauled in drapes to hide the mold and rented fake greenery to disguise the stains, was suing. Breach of contract, non-payment, legal fees added on top. The number at the bottom made her hands shake so violently she dropped the page onto the floor. "Mom," Sophie croaked, staring at Tina with wide, panicked eyes. "We don't have this kind of money." Tina snatched the letter, scanning it with her lips pressed tight. Her knuckles whitened. "We'll figure something out. We'll call family, friends. Somebody will help." But when Tina dialed her sister in Atlanta, the conversation ended in silence and a cold, "You made your bed." A cousin refused politely. Another relative hung up before Tina could finish her plea. By the end of the week, the Barrett phone tree was burned to ash. Every call answered with avoidance or disdain. While Sophie and Tina spiraled, Ellie's kitchen was alive with warmth. A faint cinnamon scent drifted from the oven, where a pie cooled on the counter. Miriam sat at the table with a glass of iced tea, while Ellie sorted a neat stack of documents. "These," Ellie said softly, sliding one page toward Miriam, "are for the scholarship fund." Miriam leaned in, eyes scanning the name across the top. The Eleanor Barrett Legacy Grant. Ellie's savings, originally earmarked for a quiet trip abroad, had instead been dedicated to providing local young women with tuition support. "You took their insults," Miriam said, lifting her glass in salute, "and turned them into opportunity. That's more than revenge, Ellie. That's power." Ellie's smile was faint but steady. "They wanted me erased. I'd rather leave something behind." Later that evening, Becca, Sophie's younger sister, slipped into Ellie's home unannounced. At just 20, she carried none of Sophie's vanity, only a wide-eyed earnestness. She wrapped her arms tightly around Ellie, her voice muffled against her shoulder. "You're the only one who inspires me," Becca whispered. "Not Mom. Not Sophie. You." Ellie's throat tightened, but she stroked Becca's hair gently, saying nothing. The moment said enough. That weekend, Ellie's legacy dinner became the talk of Charleston. Photos filled Facebook, tables glowing under chandeliers, women of every age raising glasses, the White Harbor Pavilion, glittering as if it had been waiting for this event all along. Miriam, ever the master of words, stood at the head table with her glass raised. "Pathetic," she said, her tone sharp but playful. "No." Eleanor Barrett outclassed them all. The room erupted with applause, the sound ringing like music. Ellie blushed faintly, but bowed her head, letting the noise wash over her. She didn't crave spectacle, but dignity had a way of shining, even when she tried to dim it. Meanwhile, Sophie stared at a dark phone screen. Her Instagram, once filled with glittering posts and curated smiles, was gone. Deleted. The comments, the mocking memes, the constant reminders of failure. She couldn't take it anymore. She lay curled on her bed, her wedding dress shoved in a heap on the floor, the faint mildew smell from the warehouse still clinging to its hem. Silence filled the house now, broken only by Tina's pacing footsteps downstairs. Across town, Harold Finch stood with Ellie on the polished floors of the Pavilion ballroom, now glowing with the memory of her event. The scent of polish lingered, the chandeliers catching the last of the night's light. "You've given this hall more than just another booking," Harold said, his voice deliberate. "You've given it meaning." He paused, watching her carefully. "I've been thinking of renaming the main ballroom, the Eleanor Barrett Hall." Ellie froze, her hand resting lightly on the back of a chair. The weight of his words settled like a crown she hadn't expected. The ballroom shone brighter than Ellie had ever seen it, chandeliers scattering light across rows of polished chairs. Community leaders filled the space, their voices hushed with anticipation. At the front, a walnut pedestal held a plaque draped in velvet, its covered surface promising something permanent. Harold Finch stepped to the podium, his deep voice carrying easily through the hall. "This place has hosted weddings, galas, fundraisers, but only once has it reminded us of what true dignity looks like." He paused, eyes sweeping the crowd. That night was Eleanor Barrett's legacy dinner. Ellie shifted slightly in her seat, her heart thudding. She hadn't expected more than a polite thank you. Harold continued, "Class isn't measured in youth, but in character, and character deserves recognition. So today this ballroom receives a new name." He reached for the cloth. "Ladies and gentlemen, I present the Eleanor Barrett Hall." The velvet fell, and gold letters gleamed against polished brass. The Eleanor Barrett Hall. The room erupted in applause, the sound rolling like thunder under the vaulted ceiling. Cameras flashed, catching Ellie's stunned expression. Her hand pressed briefly to her chest. For years she'd been quietly dismissed, her worth ignored. Now her name shone larger than Sophie's wedding had ever been. Beside her, Miriam squeezed her hand, eyes misting. "You've rewritten the ending," she whispered. Ellie drew a steady breath, her composure intact, though her throat tightened. She hadn't sought this moment, but the permanence of it left her breathless. When Harold motioned for her to speak, Ellie rose slowly. The hush in the hall was so complete, she could hear the faint hum of the chandeliers. At the podium she set her palms on the wood and let her voice carry, calm but resolute. "I once believed dignity was a private thing you held on to, even when others tried to strip it away. Tonight I see that carrying it quietly does not mean it goes unseen." She glanced across the audience, catching the eyes of younger women leaning forward. "This honor is not mine alone. It belongs to every woman who has been underestimated, dismissed, or told she no longer matters, yet still chose to stand tall." The applause that followed shook the walls. Flashes lit the air, capturing her poised smile, her chin lifted with quiet pride. Miles away, Tina and Sophie sat in a dim living room, the TV flickering with live coverage. The gold plaque filled the screen, Eleanor Barrett's name etched larger than life. Tina muttered under her breath, anger sharp. "He's making her into a saint." But Sophie said nothing. Her mascara was smudged, her face pale. She stared at the screen with hollow eyes, realizing she had wished her grandmother erased, and instead watched her immortalized on the very walls she once dreamed of claiming. This time there were no tears, no tantrums, just silence. Later that night, Ellie returned home, the applause still echoing faintly in her ears. She slipped off her shoes, poured herself a glass of water, and wandered toward the bookshelf where her photo albums rested. Pulling one free, she flipped through pages. Charles smiling in his city planner's jacket, Sophie as a child grinning with cake on her cheeks, Becca curled on Ellie's lap. The images felt heavier tonight, anchored by the day's events. Then she noticed it, an envelope tucked into the back, edges yellowed with time, written across the front in Charles's neat hand. "For Ellie, when you need it most." Her fingers lingered on the words. After a night of unexpected honor, she now faced something far more personal, a message from the man who had believed in her before anyone else. She sat at her kitchen table beneath the dim glow of the lamp, the house hushed around her, her pulse loud in her ears. For a moment she couldn't bring herself to break the seal. Her thumb lingered at the edge, as though opening it might release not just words, but the echo of the man who had always steadied her. Finally, with a shaky breath, she slid a letter opener beneath the flap. The paper inside crackled with age. Charles's familiar hand stretched across it in careful lines. Just one sentence filled the page. "Don't ever let them dim you." The simplicity of it undid her. Ellie pressed the letter to her chest, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. His words carried his voice, calm and sure, reminding her of nights he had wrapped an arm around her shoulders and insisted she could handle anything. Even gone, he knew what she would need most: courage. She sat with it for a long time before folding it gently back into the envelope. When Miriam arrived the next afternoon, Ellie slid the note across the table without a word. Miriam read it once, her sharp eyes softening, then twice. She pressed her lips together and nodded. He always did have a way of cutting right to the truth. Ellie gave a watery laugh, wiping her cheek. "One line, and it feels like he's standing here again." Miriam covered Ellie's hand with her own. You've honored him without even realizing it. Every step you've taken these past weeks, this is exactly what he meant. That evening, as twilight brushed the harbor in streaks of lavender, Becca knocked softly on Ellie's door. The younger woman stepped in hesitantly, her expression torn between admiration and nervousness. I saw the coverage, Becca said, her voice earnest. The ballroom, your speech, everything. You've made something real, Grandma. Something lasting. She hesitated before blurting. I want to be part of it. I don't want to follow Sophie's path. I want to intern at White Harbor. Learn how events are built, not just bragged about. Ellie's heart swelled. She cupped Becca's cheek, studying the determination in her eyes. You'll outshine us all, she said softly. And you won't need a venue to prove it. Becca hugged her tightly, the embrace anchoring Ellie in a way no headline ever could. Legacy, she realized, wasn't about plaques or applause, it was about who carried the torch next. Later that night, Ellie sat in her living room with a fire crackling low, the photos from the legacy dinner framed neatly along her mantel. Laughter frozen in still images, chandeliers glowing in the background, proof of what dignity could build. She glanced once more at Charles' letter, now resting safely in a frame on the shelf. Its words seemed to hum in the room with her, quiet but unshakable. Don't ever let them dim you. For the first time in weeks, Ellie felt something beyond vindication. She felt peace. The next morning, Harold Finch called. His voice held none of the usual formality. It was warmer, touched with something close to respect. Eleanor, he said, your legacy dinner showed me something. You've got an eye for more than contracts. You understand people. I'd like you to consider consulting on events here at White Harbor. Not just your own. Others. Bring your touch to the place. Ellie's breath caught, the proposal hanging in the air like an open door. The chandeliers glowed like constellations above her, casting their light across the polished wood floors that bore her name now. Months had passed since the chaos of Sophie's unraveling, but White Harbor Pavilion felt eternal, timeless. And tonight its grandeur was on full display. Ellie Barrett moved slowly but confidently through the crowd gathered for a charity fundraiser. The air hummed with conversation, silverware chiming against china, and the faint scent of gardenias carried from tall arrangements on every table. As she walked, people turned, not with pity or polite indifference, but with warmth. They reached for her hand, offered smiles, stopped her to say what an honor it was simply to be there with her. She felt none of the invisibility Sophie had once mocked her for. Tonight she was seen. Becca flitted at her side, clipboard in hand, her youthful energy complementing Ellie's steady grace. We raised more in the first hour than the organizers expected for the entire evening, she whispered, eyes shining. Ellie smiled, pride warming her chest. That's not me, Becca. That's you. And everyone you've brought in. You're carrying it forward. Becca squeezed her arm affectionately. I learned it from you. The girl's sincerity struck Ellie deeper than any plaque ever could. Sophie's cruelty had nearly broken her, but Becca's admiration reminded her that some seed she planted had grown beautifully. Miriam arrived a moment later, her stride brisk as always, her earrings catching the light. She carried 2 glasses of champagne, passing one to Ellie before lowering her voice. Do you realize what you've done? Ellie tilted her head, amused. Hosted a fundraiser? No. Miriam grinned, her eyes twinkling. You managed to pull off revenge and legacy in the same stroke. Not many people can say that. Ellie took a sip of the champagne, letting the bubbles fizz against her tongue. I didn't just take her venue, Miriam. I reclaimed myself. That was the point all along. Camera flashes interrupted their moment. A photographer crouched to capture Ellie with the plaque gleaming behind her, the Eleanor Barrett Hall. The gold letters reflected like fire under the chandeliers, immortalizing her in a way Sophie could never erase. Reporters hovered near the edges of the room, jotting notes as guests, toasted the success of the evening. For once, Ellie didn't shrink from the attention. She accepted it with quiet dignity, each handshake and each thank you affirming that her story had outgrown Sophie's cruelty. At one table, Harold leaned back in his chair, surveying the ballroom with a satisfied expression. When Ellie passed, he stood, his voice carrying just enough for her to hear. This place feels different now, Eleanor. Feels like it finally has a soul. Ellie inclined her head, the corners of her mouth lifting. It always had one, Harold. It just needed someone to remind people where to look. Becca joined Ellie again as the night wound down, her cheeks flushed with excitement. Grandma people kept asking about internships tonight. They want to learn. They want to be part of this. Ellie touched her shoulder gently. Then give them what I gave you, belief. The rest will follow. Becca nodded, her smile wide and certain. As the final speeches ended, and the last notes of music faded, Ellie stood near the entrance. From there she could see it all. The glittering hall, the golden plaque, the faces of women who had lifted their glasses to her name, the scent of roses and polished wood wrapped around her like a benediction. For a long time, she had let herself believe Sophie's words, that she was irrelevant, outdated, pathetic. But standing here with legacy etched in brass and carried in Becca's eyes, she knew the truth. Her granddaughter's cruelty had been meant to erase her. Instead, it had immortalized her. As the final cameras flashed, Ellie's lips curved into a knowing smile. My granddaughter said I was too old and pathetic to be seen at her wedding, she thought, her voice steady and proud. So I took the venue out from under her.